reports from the world's second largest continent. Hello, I'm Alison LaGrange. A very warm welcome from Durban, South Africa. We get you the news and the newsmakers from Africa. From elections to climate change to innovations and opportunities. As the world's attention shifts, we report from Africa, the heart of the global South. Join me every weekday live on First Post. Hello and welcome to First Post Africa, where we get you the top stories from the continent and from across the world. I'm Alison LaGrange, coming to you live from Durban, South Africa. First, let's take a look at the headlines. India downed 5 Pakistani fighter jets, including F-16s and JF-17s, during Operation Sindoor in May, in response to the Pahalgam terror attack, says the Indian Air Force chief. The Dutch Supreme Court overturns the lower court's ban on exporting F-35 fighter jet parts to Israel, but orders the government to independently assess whether the exports could violate international humanitarian law. Madagascar's capital remains under tight security ahead of planned fresh protests against President Andry Rajoelina and years of alleged misrule. The Philippine military chief says he rejected calls for the armed forces to oust President Ferdinand Marcos, as Manila was rocked by street protests last month over government corruption. And Sarah Mullally has been named as the new Archbishop of Canterbury, becoming the first woman to lead the Church of England in its history. Hello and welcome. Let's start with the GenZ protests in Morocco. Anti-government protests continue in the kingdom, which has been on edge for days now. And the death of at least 3 demonstrators has further fueled public outrage. The group leading the demonstrations is GenZ 212. It has called for the government's dismissal. Now, this comes a day after Prime Minister Aziz Akhannouch has made the first public address since the unrest broke out. On Thursday, the Prime Minister described the violent protests as regrettable and said that the government was willing to engage in dialogue and respond to the demands of the protesters. Young Moroccans have been demanding reform to the health and education sectors. Protests have slammed the government for pouring billions into the preparation for the 2030 World Cup, while many schools and hospitals lack funds and remain in a dire state. The kingdom is also set to host the Africa Cup of Nations in December. Recent reports of the deaths of 8 pregnant women at a public hospital in the city of Agadir have further fueled public outrage.
Today we are here to say that the authorities and the government must address this issue responsibly and with seriousness. We no longer have time to waste allowing public services to remain weak or giving priority to the private sector over the public good. We see the state spending money, but it is private interests that profit from it.
The country's health minister has also echoed the concerns of the people. In his speech to Parliament on Wednesday, the health minister said that though several reforms were underway, they were still insufficient to close the sector's gaps. For days now, hundreds of protesters have been rallying across cities, including the capital of Rabat, Casablanca, Marrakesh, and Agadir, to protest against corruption and social inequalities in the country. The group leading the protests has also demanded the release of all demonstrators who were detained in connection with the peaceful protests. Since the protests broke out last week, over 400 people have been arrested. Nearly 300 people, mainly from the security forces, have been injured. As the protests turned violent earlier this week, vehicles and banks were set ablaze, shops were looted, and security forces were attacked. Now, footage released by the security authorities showed clashes in a town near Agadir. In the footage, hundreds of people can be seen attacking security forces station on Wednesday night. GenZ 212 has distanced itself from the violence and vandalism seen in some cities and has urged the demonstrators to remain peaceful. As per eyewitnesses, criminals have been taking advantage of the unrest and indulging in vandalism.
As a resident of Salé, the young people I saw vandalizing and breaking things here in Salé are not linked to the young people who protested on the first day of GenZ 212. To be clear, these are young thugs who came with the intention of vandalizing and have nothing to do with health or education, and the proof is that if you ask any of them, they can't say anything useful.
As clashes intensify and public outrage grows, the situation remains tense in the kingdom. The Prime Minister has vowed to listen to the demands of the angry youth, but he has not been able to convince the demonstrators. Now, for more on this, we have with us Safa Khazraoui, the editor-in-chief at Morocco World News, joining us live from Rabat, Morocco. Welcome to Firstpost Africa.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you for having me today.
Now, the youth-led movement is calling for the government's dismissal, while Prime Minister Aziz Akhannouch is offering dialogue. From your perspective, is this offer of dialogue likely to ease the tensions, or has the government already lost credibility enough with the protesters at this stage?
Thank you. So the government indeed has twice responded to the protests, including yesterday when it reiterated that it's ready to engage in a dialogue to respond to youth. What matters the most here is how you're willing to communicate with people and whether you're capable of addressing this segment of society. Because here, you're talking to youth and not political parties and unions. Everything matters. The way you'll respond to protests and how. So the youth-led movement that actually called for those peaceful protests are a wiser generation. They know what they want. Of course, I'm talking about the youth again that launched a peaceful campaign here and not rioters. So what actually is lacking is follow-up and not only dialogue, in the sense that people want to see implementations happening and not only words. Take, for instance, that several mega projects were actually inaugurated in Morocco, like frequently, but what's ambiguous is what's next. Also, similar projects are mostly centered in urban areas. There are some rural areas where like issues are very critical, and even like with initiatives like taking place by the government and are made by the government, they are critically insufficient. So following up on how those launch projects work and how they're working, whether hospitals you're launching are really meeting people expectations, whether our local administrations, when a person needs a paper, a simple paper or a stamp or whatever activity are their demands are, whether those demands are simply met or those are, met with challenges that make people just fed up. So questions mark mostly on communication again. I also want to clarify something because I also see often see how international media criticizing the country for building stadiums and infrastructure. It's not about infrastructure. It's not about stadiums. I, as a Moroccan, want for sure to see entertainment as many, entertainment activities happening as many other Moroccans. So seeing Morocco hosting prestigious events like the World Cup and AFCON, of course, it's good. It has benefits for the country and its economy and the people. But here, it's not about this. It's, I mean,
Yes.
how you have to actually implement this, bring us prestigious events. We want
Right.
the World Cup happening. We want the AFCON happening. But this is secondary to priorities key sectors like healthcare and education.
Yes. Right. So priorities. Now,
Yeah.
with 3 deaths already reported and these nightly clashes intensifying, you've touched on some of the factors that are driving the escalation of violence. Do you see these protests spreading beyond the Gen Z base to broader society?
Look, protests from generation beyond just Gen Z were already happening. Actually, this movement of Gen Z 212
Yeah.
came in response to protests took place currently or recently, including the one in Agadir, for instance. And one of the latest other protests that took place was just in September from protesters from Al Hawz region, which was affected by the deadly earthquake of September 2023. So Gen Z are conveying
Yes.
their parents' plea, their fellows' plea from different generations. Unemployment is a challenge that Morocco faces. You will be shocked to see how many people are like with highest degrees work in jobs that has nothing to do with their professions, including PhD holders. So this is merely those Gen Z protests are merely an extension to an already ongoing protest, but it only took this dimension because a campaign of violence and riots and vandalism, which unfortunately overshadowed the peaceful protests that sought legitimate rights. So, as for factors, we cannot
Yes.
blame any party here, honestly. I have seen some interpretations either blaming youth for launching peaceful protests or the government or, blame from here and there. Of course, unlawful arrest and use of violence
Yeah.
from both sides are regrettable and something that we feel very saddened for. But whatever the factors are here, we're here seeking solutions. Obviously, there is a misunderstandings
Right.
because protests don't mean chaos, and we'll have to be careful how to distinguish between riots and vandalism and peaceful protests that are seeking legitimate rights like good quality education and good healthcare and access to healthcare without any challenges.
Right. And so now, just finally, the Health Minister has admitted that while reforms are underway, they are still insufficient. But beyond
Mhm.
healthcare, what deeper socio-economic and political grievances are perhaps fueling these protests? And in your view, what reforms would be necessary to address the frustrations of Morocco's population?
All right, if you're asking me about my perspective, the question or the answer to this question is very simple. The first reform needed is better communication with people, a better communication to mitigate and address the crisis by using a language that is easy to understand and unambiguous and clear for you're addressing youth again. You're addressing some protesters are, less than 16, 15. So you can't just like use a language that is very official and very, full of, words that as you're talking with unions
Straightforward.
or political parties again. You have to really use a communication method that is addressing that segment you're addressing and talking to. Another thing, in every country, in every,
Right.
across the world, there are dysfunctions unless it's a la la land where everything is perfect. But I think accountability and putting people in charge of any potential corruption, whoever they are, accountable in a transparent way will help a lot in making things better.
we're dealing with a serious
Right.
issue here, and that's because our people are losing trust. They no longer trust
Right.
the government and trust their pledges. So technically, we need to see, or the demands that are asked from the Gen Z movement now, and
Yes.
to see tangible results, to see an action taken against anyone, any potential party involved in corruption and dysfunctions in key sectors as such.
Right. And I thank you very much for being with us on Firstpost
Thank you.
Africa.
Thank you, Alison.
And shifting focus to East Africa, 2 Kenyan human rights activists have gone missing in Uganda. The activists, Bob Njagi and Nicholas Uyu, have been reportedly abducted by armed men while attending a campaign event of Uganda's opposition leader Bobi Wine. Wine says the pair was picked up, mafia-style, at a petrol station and driven off to an unknown destination. Ugandan police have reportedly denied having the 2 in their custody, but the Kenyan government says it is working to ensure their safe release. Now, Bobi Wine, a pop star whose real name is Robert Kyagulanyi, is running for the presidency in Uganda's next year's election. Now, he is the main challenger of the 80-year-old President Yoweri Museveni. He has held power since 1986. Now, Bobi Wine says the 2 Kenyans were being targeted by the Ugandan government because they were associated with him. Human rights groups have raised concerns over yet another enforced disappearance in the region. Several similar cases in recent years have sparked widespread condemnation and have raised fears that East African governments may be working together to contain dissent. Now, activist Bob Njagi was also picked up in Kenya last year by masked men. This was during a wave of abductions targeting government critics amid large protests. He remained missing for over a month before resurfacing after a court ordered police to produce him. He later recounted the harrowing conditions in captivity, including isolation and being denied food for most of the days. Now, earlier this year, Kenyan activist Boniface Mwangi and his Ugandan counterpart, Agatha Otoher, were detained in Tanzania, and they were in the country to support the detained opposition politician Tundu Lissu. Now, they were held without contact with anyone for days before being abandoned at their respective national borders. Now, they later recounted brutal mistreatment, including sexual abuse by Tanzanian authorities. The Tanzanian police dismissed the allegations as hearsay. Now, talking about Uganda, another opposition figure, Kizza Besigye, mysteriously disappeared in Nairobi last year, only to surface 4 days later in a military court in Uganda, where he was charged with treason. Ugandan security agencies have often been accused of orchestrating the detention of opposition politicians and rivals while not in uniform. It is seen as a method used to avoid accountability and to intimidate political opponents. Such cases highlight the continuing risks faced by human rights activists in East Africa and the challenge of holding governments accountable for enforced disappearances and political repression. And moving on, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has urged Israel to immediately release pro-Palestinian activists intercepted on an aid flotilla headed toward Gaza. Israel is facing international backlash after its military intercepted 41 ships of the global Sumud flotilla carrying over 400 people. Now, these include politicians and climate activist Greta Thunberg. They were attempting to break the blockade of Gaza and deliver humanitarian aid. The Israeli Navy halted the vessels from Wednesday, preventing them from reaching the Palestinian coastal territory. At least 5 South Africans were on board the flotilla. Now, these include Mandla Mandela, who is the grandson of Nelson Mandela. Israel says the flotilla was ordered to change course because it was approaching an active combat zone and violating a lawful naval blockade. In a statement, President Cyril Ramaphosa has said the interception in international waters violates international law and infringes on the sovereignty of the nations whose flags were flown on the flotilla's ships. In a video released by the Global Sumud Flotilla, Nelson Mandela's grandson, Mandla Mandela, who is a former member of South Africa's National Assembly, made an appeal for his release.
My name is Nkosizwe Veli Lemande. I'm a citizen of the Republic of South Africa. If you are receiving this video, it means that we have been intercepted and have been abducted by the apartheid state of Israel. I call on you to request our government to exert pressure for my immediate release.
Israel says it is transferring the intercepted activists to an Israeli port and would deport them to Europe. The flotilla left Spain in August after a 10-day stop in Tunisia last month, where organizers reported 2 drone attacks. The mission resumed toward Gaza. Israel had previously blocked similar flotilla campaigns in June and July, drawing criticism. Now, Pretoria has been a leading critic of Israel's actions in Gaza. In December of 2023, South Africa brought a case before the International Court of Justice, or the ICJ, alleging that Israel's conduct in Gaza amounts to genocide, a charge Israel denies. President Ramaphosa said the flotilla interception also violates an ICJ injunction that humanitarian aid must be allowed to flow unimpeded. Israel maintains it is attempting to prevent supplies from falling into the hands of Hamas. A growing number of countries have expressed concern over this incident, criticizing Israel for conducting the interception in international waters. Worldwide, protests have also erupted, denouncing the move. The situation remains tense as activists await deportation. South Africa is proactively pushing for their immediate release. And from Cape Town's sunny beaches to your screens, the African penguins, South Africa's waddling superstar, is fighting for its life. Once in the millions, these charming birds now number fewer than 9,000 breeding pairs, teetering on the edge of extinction. Conservationists are racing against time with artificial nests, rescue centres and new fishing rules. But experts warn it may not be enough. Let's take a closer look at how these adorable penguins are struggling to survive and why their fate matters far beyond the shorelines they call home.
For many visitors to South Africa, there's nothing quite like watching penguins waddle across sandy beaches. At Stony Point, about 100 kilometers east of Cape Town, tourists cheer as the charming birds shuffle along the shore. But behind the adorable antics lies a sobering reality. The African penguin is sliding dangerously towards extinction. Once numbering in the millions, African penguins now cling to survival with fewer than 9,000 breeding pairs. The International Fund for Animal Welfare puts the total number of mature birds at under 19,800. Conservationists warn that at this rate, these iconic birds could vanish within a decade. Penguins are more than just cute faces. They are an important indicator of ocean health. Feeding mainly on sardines and anchovies, their survival reflects the state of the broader marine ecosystem. Declining penguin numbers suggest the seas themselves are under threat. At Stony Point, conservationists work tirelessly to give penguins a fighting chance. Volunteers reinforce natural shelters and provide artificial nests to protect eggs and chicks from predators, storms, and extreme heat.
Artificial nests are used to lessen the environmental exposure to the penguins when they are breeding. So also it would be severe weather conditions and also to protect them from predators. So then they are less exposed to the outside, and then it also helps with breeding and protecting the chicks and eggs.
Very easily infected.
Injured or abandoned penguins are taken to a rehabilitation center in Cape Town. There, seabird rehabilitators feed them twice daily and ensure they swim at least 3 times a day to rebuild strength.
So they are our healthiest birds in the center. A lot of them came in with injuries. It's usually shark attacks, seal attacks, or even fishing line entanglements. Some of them came in emaciated, which is just starved completely.
Starvation is now the greatest threat to African penguins. Commercial fishing has drastically reduced sardine and anchovy stocks, leaving penguins struggling to find enough food. A legal battle in March this year brought some hope. Organizations forced the government to act, resulting in no fishing zones around 6 critical colonies. Each zone stretches about 20 kilometers offshore, helping penguins access food during breeding season.
So these closures are beneficial, absolutely, because when penguins are breeding, they are not able to swim further than 20 to 30 kilometers generally, and then they have to get back to their colony to provision for their chicks. Beyond those closures is the problem, and once juveniles fledge the colony, they go off and they travel large distances where they need to find food. And
still, conservationists warn that these measures are only a start. Juvenile penguins face a steep survival challenge once they leave the nest, with fewer than half surviving their first months at sea. Legal protections and conservation efforts offer hope, but without stricter limits on fishing and continued support, the African penguins may face its final plunge. Tourists may still delight at the sight of these waddling wonders, but urgent action is needed if future generations are to witness the same spectacle.
And that's it on the show for today. We will see you again at the same time on Monday. Thank you for watching. Have a great weekend, and goodbye.
Nice one. Straight down the middle.
Hi, welcome to First Sports. I'm Rupa Ramani. Let's get the show started.